In Anchorage, Alaska, during the 1970s and early 1980s, there was a baker everyone knew and respected. Robert Hansen, owner of a successful local bakery, devoted husband, father of 2 children, a man who smiled at his customers while selling them fresh bread every morning. His neighbors described him as quiet, shy, a bit odd, maybe with his stutter and his awkward way of speaking, but harmless, completely harmless. What they didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was that this respectable baker was living a double life so dark, so twisted, that when it finally came to light, it would shake all of Alaska to its foundations. Before I continue with this story, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from? What city? What country? What time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments. If you're interested in true crime stories, especially those that reveal how evil can hide behind the most ordinary smiles, subscribe to this channel. Like this video, share it with someone who loves true crime. Turn on notifications because this story I'm about to tell you is one of the most disturbing in the history of American serial killers. Robert Christian Hansen was born on February 15, 1939, in Estherville, Iowa. A small town, quiet, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. His father, Christian Hansen, was a Danish immigrant who owned a bakery. A strict man, severe, demanding, the type of father who was never satisfied, who always expected more. From a very young age, Robert worked long hours in his father's bakery, baking bread, cleaning, doing everything his father ordered him to do. But hard work wasn't the worst part of Robert's childhood. The worst was school. Robert Hansen was a small boy, thin, weak. He had severe acne that covered his face, leaving scars that would never disappear. He wore glasses, and he had a pronounced stutter that got worse when he was nervous or stressed. The other kids bullied him mercilessly. They called him names. They laughed at his stutter. They avoided him as if he were contagious. Robert had no friends. He had no one, so he found refuge in the woods. He spent hours alone hunting, tracking animals, perfecting his skills with rifles and bows. In the woods, Robert felt powerful, in control, respected by the prey he hunted, even if they were just animals. But that feeling of power wasn't enough, and the seeds of something dark were beginning to grow. The bullying Robert Hansen endured wasn't just occasional teasing. It was relentless, daily, cruel in the way only children can be cruel. The girls at school wouldn't look at him. They'd turn away when he approached. Some would laugh openly at his attempts to talk to them, mimicking his stutter in front of their friends. Robert asked girls to school dances. Every single one rejected him. He tried to join sports teams. The coaches felt sorry for him, but the other boys made it clear he wasn't welcome. He was the kid who ate lunch alone, who walked home alone, who spent every Friday and Saturday night alone while his classmates went to parties and football games and lived the teenage life he desperately wanted. His father didn't help matters. Christian Hansen was ashamed of his son, ashamed of his weakness, ashamed of his inability to fit in. "You need to be stronger," his father would tell him. "Stop that stuttering. Stop being so pathetic." But Robert couldn't stop stuttering, and he couldn't stop being what he was. So the rage built, silently, steadily, like water behind a dam, pressure increasing year after year. Robert spent more and more time in the woods. Hunting became an obsession. He'd track deer for hours, studying their movements, learning their patterns. And when he finally pulled the trigger, when he saw the animal fall, he felt something he never felt anywhere else. Power, control, revenge in a way, against a world that had rejected him. But animals weren't enough. Not forever. In 1960, at age 21, Robert Hansen committed his first known crime: arson. He set fire to the Pocahontas County Board of Education bus garage, destroying 3 of 7 buses. When police arrested him, he couldn't explain why he'd done it, or wouldn't, but the implication was clear. This was revenge. Against the school system that had failed to protect him from bullies. Against the institution that had allowed him to suffer for years. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He served 20 months. During his incarceration, he was evaluated by a psychiatrist. The diagnosis: manic depression with periodic schizophrenic episodes. The psychiatrist noted that Hansen had an infantile personality and was obsessed with getting revenge on people he felt had wronged him, especially women. The report stated clearly, Robert Hansen was dangerous. His obsession with revenge could turn violent. But when Hansen was released, that warning was filed away and forgotten. He tried to rebuild his life. In 1963, he married a woman named Darla. She was gentle, quiet, and seemed oblivious to the demons Robert carried. They had 2 children together, a boy and a girl. Robert tried to be a good father, a good husband. He worked hard. He stayed out of trouble. But the old rage was still there, simmering, waiting. In 1967, the family made a decision that would change everything. They moved to Alaska. Alaska in the 1960s and 70s was a place of new beginnings. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline was under construction, bringing thousands of workers to Anchorage. The city was booming, growing, full of opportunities. And for Robert Hansen, it was the perfect place to reinvent himself. In Anchorage, he opened his own bakery, Hansen's Bakery. It became successful. Customers loved his bread, his pastries, his attention to detail. To all appearances, Robert Hansen seemed to have found his place. He had a thriving business, a loving wife, 2 beautiful children, a house in the suburbs, the American dream. But there was something else he loved about Alaska: the wilderness. Alaska offered millions of acres of wild land, dense forests, mountains, rivers, places where a man could disappear for days and never see another human being. And Robert Hansen became an expert hunter. He hunted moose, caribou, bears. He set several local hunting records recognized by the Pope and Young Club, a bow hunting organization. His hunting trophies adorned his house. Moose antlers on the roof, taxidermied animal heads on the walls, wolf pelts on the floor. His house looked like a taxidermy museum. But what his neighbors, his wife, his children didn't know was that Robert Hansen was practicing for something else. Something that wouldn't involve animals. Because sometime in the early 1970s, Robert Hansen made a decision. A decision that would change the lives of dozens of women and turn Anchorage into the hunting ground of one of America's most diabolical serial killers. He decided he was going to hunt people. Specifically, he was going to hunt women. And his first victim was probably in 1971. But before he committed murder, he needed to test his methods. In December 1971, Robert Hansen was arrested twice in the same month. First for kidnapping and attempting to rape an unidentified housewife. Then for raping an unidentified sex worker. He pleaded no contest to assault with a deadly weapon on the first charge. The rape charge involving the sex worker was dropped as part of a plea deal. Hansen was sentenced to 5 years in prison. After serving 6 months, he was placed in a work release program and released to a halfway house. 6 months for kidnapping and rape. And just like that, Robert Hansen was back on the streets of Anchorage. Back to his bakery. Back to his wife and children. Back to his respectable life. But he'd learned something important during those attacks. He'd learned what kind of women he could target without arousing too much suspicion. Sex workers, exotic dancers, women on the margins of society. Women who, if they disappeared, wouldn't be missed right away. Women the police wouldn't work too hard to find. And he'd learned something else. He needed to be more careful, more methodical, more controlled. He couldn't just attack women randomly and hope to get away with it. He needed a system. And over the next year, as he settled back into his routine, as he smiled at customers and baked bread and played with his children, Robert Hansen was developing that system. A system that would allow him to kill again and again without getting caught. A system that would work for over a decade. Robert Hansen's method was simple but effective. He would drive through downtown Anchorage in his car, usually late at night, looking for women working the streets. When he found one he wanted, he'd approach her, offer money, sometimes $200, sometimes $300. More than most Johns would pay. The women would get in his car, thinking it was just another transaction. But once they were inside, once the door was closed, everything changed. Hansen would pull out a gun, usually a .357 Magnum revolver. He'd point it at the woman's head. "Don't scream," he'd say. "Don't make any noise, or I'll kill you right here." Then he'd handcuff them, drive them to his house on Old Harbor Road. His wife and children were often asleep upstairs. They never knew what was happening in the basement below them. In the basement, Hansen would torture and rape his victims. For hours, sometimes all night, he kept them chained. He kept them terrified. He kept them completely under his control. And when he was finished, when he'd satisfied whatever dark urge was driving him, he'd tell them he was going to let them go. But he was lying. Instead, he'd load them into his car, drive them to Merrill Field, a small public-use airport near Anchorage, and there he'd put them in his private plane, Piper Super Cub, a small two-seat aircraft perfect for flying into remote areas. He'd fly them into the Alaskan wilderness, and then the real hunt would begin. The area around the Knik River became Robert Hansen's hunting ground. Remote, beautiful, deadly. He'd land his plane on a sandbar or a small clearing. Then he'd let the women out. Sometimes they were still handcuffed. Sometimes he'd freed their hands. It didn't matter much either way, because then Hansen would give them a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. "You can run," he'd say. "I'll give you a head start. If you make it to the road, you're free." The nearest road was miles away. Through dense forest, across freezing rivers, over treacherous terrain. The women had no proper clothing, no shoes meant for hiking, no food, no water, no compass. They had no real chance. But they ran anyway, because what else could they do? And Hansen would wait. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, letting the fear build, letting them get deep into the forest. Then he'd pick up his rifle, his Ruger Mini 14.223 caliber, the same rifle he used for hunting caribou and moose. And he'd start tracking them. He was an expert hunter. He could track anything. He knew how to read signs in the wilderness that most people wouldn't even notice. A broken branch, a footprint in soft earth, a thread of clothing caught on a bush. He'd follow them, slowly, methodically, enjoying every moment. And when he caught up to them, and he always caught up, he'd shoot them. Sometimes in the back as they tried to flee, sometimes in the head. Sometimes he'd wound them first, then watch them suffer before delivering the final shot. After they were dead, he'd either bury them in shallow graves or simply leave them there for the animals to find. Then he'd fly back to Anchorage, back to his bakery, back to his wife and children, and nobody suspected a thing. Between 1971 and 1983, Robert Hansen murdered at least 17 women, possibly as many as 21. But the true number could be much higher. We know the names of some of them. Roxanne Eastland, 24 years old, found September 6, 1980, near the Knik River. She'd been missing since June 28, 1980. Joanna Messina, 24 years old, found in 1980 near Seward Highway. She'd been missing since May 1980. Sherry Morrow, 23 years old, found September 12, 1982, near the Knik River. She'd been shot with a .223 caliber rifle. Paula Golding, 30 years old, found September 2, 1983, near the Knik River, also shot with a .223 caliber rifle. Eklutna Annie, still unidentified, found July 25, 1980, believed to be between 16 to 25 years old, wearing a necklace with turquoise and pink beads. Each of these women had lives, dreams, families who loved them, but Hansen chose them specifically because he thought nobody would miss them, because they were sex workers or exotic dancers, because they lived on the margins. He was partially right. When these women disappeared, police didn't always take the reports seriously. Missing sex workers weren't a priority. But Hansen was also wrong, because these women did matter. Their families did search for them. Their friends did worry about them. And eventually, their disappearances would create a pattern that even the Anchorage Police Department couldn't ignore. But that would take time. Years. And in those years, Hansen kept hunting. Anchorage in the 1970s and early 80s was experiencing massive growth due to pipeline construction. The population was transient. People came and went constantly. It was difficult to keep track of who was in the city and who wasn't. For police, it was almost impossible to distinguish between someone who had simply moved away and someone who had legitimately disappeared. And this made it much easier for Hansen's crimes to go unnoticed. When a sex worker disappeared, often nobody reported her missing. Or if they did, police assumed she'd just moved to another city. When an exotic dancer stopped showing up for work, her employers usually assumed she'd found a better job elsewhere. Nobody connected the dots. Nobody realized there was a pattern. But some people did notice. The sex workers and exotic dancers themselves began to whisper among themselves, to warn each other. Be careful with quiet guys, guys who stutter, guys who fly small planes. But those warnings didn't reach the police. Because the police, frankly, weren't paying much attention to what happened to women on society's margins. That would change in 1983, when a 17-year-old girl would do something no other Robert Hansen victim had managed to do: escape. Before we continue, I need to know, are you still here? Where are you listening from? What time is it? Let me know in the comments. If you've made it this far in the story, thank you. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Like this video, share it. Turn on notifications, because what comes next is how one teenage girl's courage brought down one of America's most prolific serial killers. Her name was Cindy Paulson. She was 17 years old, a sex worker and dancer in Anchorage. She lived with her mother. She struggled with drug addiction. She was trying to survive the best way she could in a world that wasn't kind to girls like her. On June 13, 1983, Cindy was on the street when a car pulled up beside her. A man with thinning dark hair, glasses, and a noticeable stutter leaned over from the driver's seat. "I'll pay you $200 for oral sex," he said. $200 was good money. Cindy agreed and got in the car. But as soon as she closed the door, everything changed. The man pulled out a gun, a .357 Magnum revolver. He pointed it directly at her. "Don't scream," he said. "Don't make any noise, or I'll kill you right here." Cindy froze. Her survival instinct kicked in. She knew that if she wanted to live, she had to do exactly what he said. The man pulled out handcuffs and locked them around Cindy's wrists. Then he drove. Not to a hotel, not to a safe place, to his house, Robert Hansen's house on Old Harbor Road. And Cindy knew with absolute certainty that she was going to die. When Robert Hansen brought Cindy Paulson to his house, she knew she was in mortal danger. She'd seen his face, she knew his car, and now she knew where he lived. That meant one thing: he planned to kill her, because if he let her live, she could identify him. Hansen took Cindy to the basement of his house, and there, for the next several hours, he tortured and raped her repeatedly. He chained her by the neck with a rope tied to a coffee table. He kept the handcuffs on her wrists the entire time. The wall was covered with taxidermied animals, caribou heads, wolf pelts, mounted fish, and Cindy realized she was just another prey to this man, another thing to hunt. Hansen kept telling her he'd calm her down, that if she cooperated, if she did what he wanted, he wouldn't hurt her. But Cindy didn't believe him. She'd seen the look in his eyes. She'd felt the pleasure he derived from her fear. She knew he planned to kill her. After hours of abuse, Hansen fell asleep on a couch near where Cindy was chained. She stayed awake, alert, waiting. Around 5 a.m., Hansen woke up. He told Cindy to get ready, that they were going to take a plane ride. And Cindy knew exactly what that meant. He was going to take her to the wilderness. He was going to release her. He was going to hunt her. He was going to kill her. But Cindy Paulson wasn't going to give up without a fight. Hansen drove Cindy to Merrill Field, the small airport where he kept his plane. She still had handcuffs on. She still had no shoes. She was still completely at his mercy, or so he thought. Hansen parked the car near his plane and got out. He told Cindy to stay where she was, not to move, that if she tried to run, he'd chase her down and kill her. Then he walked toward the plane to begin loading it with fuel and supplies. And Cindy took her chance. She threw herself into the driver's seat. With her hands still cuffed, she managed to open the car door, and she ran, barefoot, handcuffed, terrified. She ran toward the nearest road with everything she had. Hansen turned around just in time to see Cindy escape. He chased after her, yelling for her to come back, threatening her. But Cindy kept running. She reached 6th Avenue, and by luck or fate, a truck was passing at exactly that moment. The driver, a man named Robert Yount, saw a young girl, barefoot, handcuffed, running down the street. He saw a man chasing her with a gun. He stopped immediately. "Get in!" he shouted. Cindy threw herself into the truck and Yount sped away, leaving Hansen standing in the middle of the street, watching his victim escape. For the first time in over a decade of hunting women, Robert Hansen had let one get away, and that mistake would cost him everything. Robert Yount took Cindy Paulson to the Mush Inn, a local motel. Then he called the police. When officers from the Anchorage Police Department arrived, they found Cindy in room 110, still handcuffed, still traumatized, but alive. They took her to APD headquarters, where she gave her statement. And what she told them was astonishing in its detail. She described her attacker perfectly. His stutter, his pockmarked face, his glasses, his dark hair. She described his car, a Buick. She described his house, the blue house with the large picture window, the moose antlers on the roof, the garage on the left, the dead end sign. She described the basement, the taxidermied animals, the coffee table, the handcuffs, the rope. And she described the plane, a small four-seater aircraft. She even remembered the tail number. Police verified the tail number. It belonged to Robert Hansen. They had his name. They had his address. They had a surviving victim willing to testify. Finally, after over a decade, they had their man. Or so they thought. When police confronted Robert Hansen about Cindy Paulson's accusation, he denied everything. "She's a prostitute and drug addict," Hansen said with his familiar stutter. "She's trying to get me in trouble because I refused to pay her for extortion." Hansen had an alibi. Two of his friends swore he'd been with them the entire night of June 13th. And Hansen had something else working in his favor, his reputation. He was a respected baker, family man, a quiet guy who'd never caused anyone trouble. He was a member of local hunting groups. His neighbors loved him. How could a man like that be a serial killer? By contrast, Cindy Paulson was a young sex worker with a history of drug abuse. She had no permanent home. She had no credentials. Who was the police going to believe? They chose to believe Hansen. They let him go. Cindy Paulson was devastated. She'd risked everything to escape. She'd gone to the police. She'd told her story. And nobody believed her. But there was someone who did believe her. Detective Glenn Flotha of the Alaska State Troopers. Detective Glenn Flotha had been investigating a series of disappearances and murders of women in the Anchorage area for years. Exotic dancers, sex workers, young women who simply vanished. And some of their bodies were being found in the wilderness, near the Nick River, with gunshot wounds from a .223 caliber rifle. Flotha knew there was a serial killer operating in Alaska. He just needed to prove it. When he heard about Cindy Paulson and her escape from Robert Hansen, Flotha knew he'd finally found his man. He contacted the FBI and requested help. The FBI sent their best profiler, John Douglas, the legendary agent whose work would inspire the series Mindhunter. Douglas created a profile of the killer: low self-esteem, history of rejection by women, experienced hunter, obsession with trophies from his victims, likely stutter or other speech impediment. Every point matched Robert Hansen perfectly. On September 2nd, 1983, the body of another victim, Paula Golding, appeared near the Nick River. She'd been murdered with a .223 caliber rifle. Flotha knew it was Hansen's work. He pushed harder. He investigated deeper. And finally, the two friends who had given Hansen an alibi for the night he attacked Cindy Paulson confessed they'd lied. Hansen had no alibi. They obtained a search warrant. On October 27, 1983, more than 50 officers, including heavily armed members of the Tactical Operations Unit, surrounded Robert Hansen's house on Old Harbor Road. They knocked on the door. Hansen opened it, and he was arrested on charges of assault, kidnapping, multiple weapons offenses, theft, and insurance fraud related to the attack on Cindy Paulson. Then police began searching the house. What they found was overwhelming. In the attic, hidden in a corner, they found an arsenal of firearms, including a Ruger Mini 14.223 caliber rifle, the exact type of weapon that had been used in the backpacker murders. They found jewelry, necklaces, rings, bracelets that belonged to missing women. And they found something else, something that would chill anyone who saw it. Hidden behind the headboard of Hansen's bed, they found an aeronautical map of the area around Anchorage. And on that map were 37 small X marks made in ink. Each X represented a place where Hansen had buried or left a victim's body. Some of the locations had already been discovered by police. Others hadn't. The evidence was incontrovertible. Robert Hansen was the killer they'd been looking for all these years. But Hansen still wasn't talking. For weeks after his arrest, Robert Hansen maintained his innocence. He had a lawyer, a good one, and he knew that without a confession, the prosecution would have a harder time proving he'd committed murder. They had circumstantial evidence: the jewelry, the map, the rifle, Cindy Paulson's testimony. But they didn't have bodies that could definitively be linked to Hansen's rifle. They didn't have eyewitnesses to the murders. They didn't have a confession. Detective Flo knew he needed Hansen to talk. So he used psychology. He brought Hansen into an interrogation room. Not aggressive, not threatening, just two men talking. "You know we have the map," Flo said calmly. "We know what those marks mean. We're gonna find those bodies, Robert. It's only a matter of time." Hansen said nothing. "I've been talking to the FBI profilers," Flo continued. "They told me something interesting. They said you probably started small. Petty crimes, theft, then escalated. And they said there's probably a reason for all of this. Something in your past that hurt you." Hansen's jaw tightened. "They told me about men like you," Flo said. "Men who were bullied. Men who were rejected by women. Men who felt powerless and wanted to feel powerful." And something in Hansen broke. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, over several days of careful questioning, Robert Hansen began to talk. He told Flo about his childhood, the bullying, the rejection, the rage that had built inside him for years. He told him about the first attacks in 1971, how he'd gotten away with it, how that had emboldened him. And then, finally, he told him about the murders. Robert Hansen's confession was chilling in its detail and its complete lack of remorse. He described his victims as objects, as prey, as things he hunted for sport. "I hunted," he said simply. "It was what I knew how to do." He confessed to murdering 17 women between 1971 and 1983. He confessed to raping 30 others. He described his method in disturbing detail, how he chose his victims, how he kidnapped them, how he tortured them, how he flew them to the wilderness, how he hunted them. Some he shot in the back as they ran. Some he shot in the head. Some he tortured first, prolonging their agony as long as possible. "They didn't suffer too much," Hansen said, as if this was somehow a kindness. "I was a good shot. Most of them died quickly." The investigators had to hide their disgust. They needed Hansen to keep talking, to tell them where the bodies were. And eventually he did. Hansen agreed to take investigators to the locations where he'd buried his victims. They flew over the Alaskan wilderness in helicopters while Hansen pointed out locations. "There," he'd say, and there too." Over the following months, authorities found the remains of 8 more women based on Hansen's information. In total, 12 bodies were recovered. 11 have been identified. One remains known only as Eklutna Annie. But Hansen had confessed to 17 murders, and there were 37 marks on that map, which means there are probably more victims. More women who were never found. More families who never got closure. On February 18, 1984, Robert Hansen pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of assault, 1 count of kidnapping, and several weapons-related offenses. He was sentenced to 461 years plus life without the possibility of parole. The judge said at sentencing, "This court has faced many disturbing cases, but none like this. The depravity, the cruelty, the complete disregard for human life demonstrated by this defendant is incomprehensible." Cindy Paulson attended the sentencing. She sat in the courtroom, directly behind Hansen, and watched as he was sentenced. Afterward, when asked how she felt, she said, "I'm finally safe. I can finally breathe." Several family members of victims gave impact statements. Paula Golding's father stood before the court, his voice shaking with rage and grief. "My daughter was a person," he said. "She had dreams. She had a future. And this monster took all of that away. Not just from her, but from all of us who loved her." Sherry Morrow's mother couldn't speak through her tears. She simply held up a photo of her daughter, smiling and young, and let the image speak for her. Hansen sat through it all with no visible emotion. No tears, no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. When given a chance to speak, he declined. Robert Hansen was sent to Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska, a maximum security facility where he would spend the rest of his life. He never showed remorse. He never apologized to the families of his victims. He never expressed regret for what he'd done. In interviews with psychologists over the years, Hansen consistently blamed his victims. He said they'd provoked him, tempted him, deserved what happened to them. He died in 2014 at the age of 75 from natural causes in prison. His death was met with mixed feelings. Some felt relief that the monster was finally gone. Others felt he'd died too easily, that he hadn't suffered enough for his crimes. The legacy of Robert Hansen lives on. His case has inspired movies, documentaries, TV episodes, and books. In 2013, the film The Frozen Ground was released, starring Nicolas Cage as Detective Glenn Flothy and John Cusack as Hansen. In 2020, Investigation Discovery released The Butcher Baker, Mind of a Monster, a documentary exploring Hansen's psychology and the lasting impact of his crimes. And in 2021, using forensic genetic genealogy, authorities finally identified one of Hansen's unidentified victims. Horseshoe Harriet turned out to be Robin Pelkey, 19, from Colorado, but Eklutna Annie remains unidentified. A young woman, probably between 16 and 25 years old, found on July 25, 1980. We still wait to know who she was. We still wait to give her name back. And there are probably more victims, more women whose names we'll never know, more X marks on that map that were never recovered. Women who were chosen because Hansen thought nobody would miss them, because they were marginalized, because they were vulnerable. But he was wrong. Their lives mattered, their deaths mattered, and their stories deserve to be told. The Robert Hansen case also changed how law enforcement handles missing persons cases involving sex workers and other marginalized populations. Before Hansen, these cases were often given low priority. The assumption was that these women had simply moved on, left town, started new lives elsewhere. Hansen proved how deadly that assumption could be. Now, most police departments have protocols specifically designed to investigate disappearances of sex workers and other vulnerable populations with the same urgency as any other missing person case. It's a change that came too late for Hansen's victims, but it may save lives in the future. Detective Glenn Flothy, who broke the case, retired from the Alaska State Troopers in 1993. He spent his retirement speaking about the Hansen case, training other law enforcement officers on how to investigate serial killers. He died in 2016 at the age of 69. Cindy Paulson, the young woman who escaped and whose testimony was crucial to the case, struggled for years after the trial. The trauma of what Hansen did to her, combined with the guilt of being the one who survived when so many others didn't, took a heavy toll. But she survived. She got clean from drugs. She rebuilt her life. In interviews years later, she said, "I think about those other women all the time. I think about how I got lucky and they didn't. And I think my job now is to make sure people remember them, to make sure they weren't forgotten. And that's what we do here. We remember. We remember Roxanne Eastland, who loved music and dreamed of becoming a singer. We remember Joanna Messina, who was trying to save money to go to college. We remember Sherry Morrow, who was a devoted mother trying to provide for her children. We remember Paula Golding, who volunteered at animal shelters and wanted to be a veterinarian. We remember all of them, every single one. And we remember Eklutna Annie. Whoever she was, wherever she came from, whatever dreams she had, she deserves to be remembered too. If you've made it this far, if you listened to this complete story, thank you. Thank you for remembering the victims of Robert Hansen. Thank you for acknowledging that they were more than just statistics. They were daughters, sisters, friends. They were real people with dreams and hopes and lives that deserve to be lived. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Like this video. Share it with someone who loves true crime and who believes every victim deserves to be remembered. Turn on notifications for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments. Where did you listen to this story from? What time is it where you are? And what do you think about cases like this, where evil hides behind a facade of normalcy? The story of Robert Hansen is a reminder that monsters often look like normal people, that evil can bake bread and smile at customers while planning its next hunt. And it's a reminder that we must believe victims when they speak. Because if police had believed Cindy Paulson immediately, if they hadn't dismissed her testimony because of her profession and her struggle with drugs, Hansen might have been stopped sooner. More lives could have been saved. So let's remember, not just the monster that Robert Hansen was, but the brave women who survived him, like Cindy Paulson, and those who didn't. May their names not be forgotten. May their stories continue to be told. Until the next story. February 24th, 1978. A Friday night like any other. 5 friends climbed into a turquoise and white Mercury Montego, excited to watch a college basketball game. They were heading to Chico, California, less than 50 miles from their home in Yuba City. A simple trip, a game, and then back home. None of them knew they would never return. Their names were Gary Mathias, 25 years old, Jack Madruga, 30 years old, Jackie Hewitt, 24 years old, Ted Weiher, 32 years old, and Bill Sterling, 29 years old. They were called the Boys because that's how their families affectionately referred to them. Before you keep listening, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? What city? What country? What time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments, because the story I'm about to tell you happened on a cold winter night in a forest that still keeps its secrets. If you're intrigued by unsolved mysteries, subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it with someone who loves true crime, and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss how this story ends. Now, back to those 5 friends. They all had mild intellectual disabilities or psychiatric conditions. Ted and Jackie functioned on the autism spectrum, though in the 70s it wasn't diagnosed that way. Bill and Jack Madruga were considered slow learners, and Gary Mathias had been diagnosed with schizophrenia after serving in the army. But none of that really defined them. What defined them was their love of basketball. They played together on a team called the Gateway Gators, sponsored by the Yuba City Vocational Rehabilitation Center. And the next day, February 25th, they had their first game in a Special Olympics tournament. A tournament they'd been waiting for weeks. The winners would receive a week-long vacation in Los Angeles. Their uniforms were laid out on their beds, their new shoes freshly cleaned, everything ready for the big day. But first, the game in Chico. UC Davis versus Chico State, their favorite team playing just an hour away. They climbed into Jack Madruga's Mercury around 6 p.m. 5 friends, 1 car, a simple destination, What nobody knew was that something would go terribly wrong, and that 4 months later, when the snow finally melted, what they would find in the mountains would be so disturbing, so impossible to explain, that this case would become known as America's Dyatlov Pass. Because what happened to these 5 men that night defies all logic. And to this day, nobody really knows what happened. They arrived in Chico without any problems. The trip was normal. Along Highway 70, through California's Central Valley, a route they'd taken before. Jack Madruga was driving. He was careful with his car, almost obsessive. The Mercury was his pride and joy. The game started at 8 p.m. UC Davis versus Chico State. And the boys were there, in the stands, cheering for their team. The local Chico newspaper editor would remember them later. He said they sat apart from other spectators. There was something distinctive about them, something that made people notice them. The game ended around 9:30 p.m. UC Davis won. The boys were happy, and then they did something completely normal, something thousands of people do every night after an event. They went to a convenience store, Bears Market, 3 blocks from the university. They walked in just before 10 p.m. The clerk was annoyed because she was already closing, but she allowed them to buy candy, chocolate bars, chocolate milk, sodas, provisions for the drive home. The clerk watched them leave, watched them get into the turquoise and white Mercury, watched them drive away heading south, toward Yuba City, toward home. That was the last confirmed time anyone saw them alive. But here's where the story gets strange, because the route from Chico to Yuba City is straightforward. Highway 70 South. No detours, no possible confusion. An hour's drive, maybe a bit more. It's a route Jack Madruga knew well, a route they'd taken several times before. So what happened between 10 p.m. on Friday, February 24th, and 5 a.m. on Saturday, February 25th? Why did 5 men who were eager to get home, who had an important tournament the next day, who never stayed out all night, simply disappear? Their mothers started calling each other at 5 in the morning. None of the boys had returned. Not Gary, not Jack, not Jackie, not Ted, not Bill, none of them. And for families who knew their sons' routines, who knew they would never stay out without calling, this was terrifying. Jack Madruga's mother, Mabel, called the Yuba City Police Department at 8 a.m. They told her to wait, that maybe the boys had stayed over somewhere. But Mabel knew something was wrong, terribly wrong. At 8 p.m. on Saturday, after waiting all day, the families gathered and filed official missing persons reports. 5 men, missing. Police issued an alert, described the 1969 turquoise and white Mercury Montego, asked the public to report any sightings, and then 3 days later the first clue arrived. But that clue would only deepen the mystery. February 27, 1978, 3 days after the disappearance. A U.S. Forest Service ranger was patrolling a remote mountain road in Plumas National Forest. It was a dirt road, high in the Sierra Nevada mountains, covered in snow. And there, parked on a snowbank, he found a turquoise and white Mercury Montego. The ranger had seen it 2 days earlier, on February 25th, but assumed it belonged to a skier. He hadn't paid it much attention. But now, 3 days later, the car was still there. Not moved. No signs of life around it. He called the authorities. The location of the car was disturbing. It was on the Oroville-Quincy Highway, about 70 miles east of Chico, completely in the opposite direction from Yuba City. Completely off route. To get there from Chico, the boys would have had to drive east, into the mountains, up increasingly remote dirt roads, away from everything familiar. Why? When investigators examined the car, what they found was even more puzzling. The Mercury was in perfect working condition. The engine was fine. The tires were fine. There was a quarter tank of gas, enough to drive for hours. The car was stuck in about 6 inches of snow. Nothing serious. 5 grown men could have easily pushed it out, but instead they'd abandoned it. The doors were unlocked. One window was slightly open. The snacks they'd bought at Bears Market had been consumed. The rappers were in the car, but the men weren't there, and strangest of all, the car keys were missing. Investigators began to search. They tracked the area around the car. They looked for footprints in the snow. They looked for signs of struggle, of violence, of anything that would explain why the men had left a perfectly functional vehicle in the middle of the snowy mountains. They found nothing conclusive, but a witness came forward with a story that, if true, made everything even more terrifying. His name was Joseph Shans, and what he saw that night on the mountain would change everything. Joseph Shans was 55 years old. He was a cardiologist from Yuba City who owned a cabin in the mountains near where the mercury was found. On the night of February 24th, Shans had driven toward his cabin, but his car got stuck in the snow on the gravel road, not far from where Madruga's mercury would later be found. And then, while trying to free his car, he suffered a heart attack. What happened next, according to Shans, was so strange that investigators weren't sure if they could believe him. Shans said that around 11:30 p.m., while lying in his car recovering from the heart attack, he saw headlights approaching from behind him. Two vehicles. One was a car. The other was a pickup truck. The vehicles stopped about 20 feet from his car. Shans yelled for help, but the vehicles immediately turned off their lights. Then he heard voices, whistling, the sound of people moving around in the darkness. And then, according to Shans, he saw something even stranger. He saw what he thought was a group of men, a woman, and a baby, walking in the headlights of another vehicle. He yelled for help again. The lights went off. The voices stopped. Everything went silent. Shans spent the rest of the night in his car. When his gas ran out and the cold became unbearable, he walked 8 miles down the mountain to seek help. On the way, he passed by Madruga's Mercury. It was parked exactly where he'd seen the group of people the night before. But Shans didn't think much about it at the time. Only when he heard about the disappearances on the news, days later, did he contact police. His story raised disturbing questions. Had he really seen the Yuba County Five that night? Were they with a woman and a baby? Or had the pain and trauma of the heart attack made him imagine everything? Investigators verified his story as much as they could. His car was where he said it was. The people who picked him up the next morning confirmed he'd been stuck on the mountain. But the part about the woman and baby could never be confirmed. Investigators never found evidence that a woman and baby were on the mountain that night. And Shans was known locally as someone who sometimes exaggerated or fabricated stories. So could they trust his testimony? They didn't know, but it was all they had. Meanwhile, time was passing, and the snow in the mountains was getting deeper with each passing day. Searching Plumas National Forest in the middle of winter was almost impossible. The snow was several feet deep in some areas. The terrain was treacherous. Temperatures dropped well below freezing at night. If the boys were out there, how long could they survive? Families prayed. Volunteers searched. Helicopters flew overhead when weather permitted. But they found nothing. February became March. March became April. April became May. And the snow began to melt. June 4th, 1978. More than 3 months after the disappearance. A group of motorcyclists was exploring trails in Plumas National Forest. They were in a remote area, about 19 miles north of where the mercury had been found. They came upon a camp that the Forest Service maintained for firefighting crews during fire season. There were several trailers there, all locked up for the winter. One of the trailers had a broken window. The motorcyclists approached, and then they smelled something. Something terrible. Something dead. They opened the trailer door, and the smell hit them like a physical wall. Inside, on a bed, they found a body. It was wrapped in 8 sheets, rolled and tucked tightly around the body, covering everything except the lower legs. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition. But from personal items found nearby, a wallet with cash, a nickel ring with Ted engraved on it, a gold necklace. Investigators were able to quickly identify him. It was Ted Weiher. Ted Weiher, 32 years old, the biggest of the group, the gentle giant who always smiled at strangers. He was dead. and the circumstances of his death were completely baffling. When he left his house on February 24th, Ted was freshly shaved. Now he had a long, full beard. Based on the beard growth, medical examiners estimated he'd been alive for 8 to 13 weeks after the disappearance, almost 3 months. Ted had survived in that trailer for almost 3 months, and then he died of starvation and hypothermia. That alone was tragic. But what made the case go from tragic to completely incomprehensible were the details of what was inside the trailer, and what Ted hadn't used. Pause here for a moment. Are you still with me? What time is it where you are? Where are you listening from? Let me know in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Like this video, share it. Turn on notifications, because what I'm about to tell you now is the part that makes this case truly one of the most disturbing in American crime history. When investigators fully examined the trailer where Ted Weiher died, what they found left them completely baffled. The trailer was fully stocked to survive. There was a fireplace, with firewood stored nearby, with matches, with paperback books and wooden furniture that could have easily been burned for fire. Ted never lit a fire. Not a single attempt. There was heavy forestry clothing, thick coats, boots, gloves, clothing that could have kept a man warm in the brutal cold of the winter mountains. Ted never put on the clothing. He was wearing a velour shirt and lightweight pants when he died. Inadequate for the weather, there was a propane tank connected to the trailer, a full tank that could have provided heat and fuel for cooking. All they had to do was turn on that gas, said Yuba County Lieutenant Lance Ayers to reporters, and they would have had gas for the trailer and heat. Ted never touched the propane tank. And then there was the food. In a storage shed outside the trailer, there were C rations. Individual military rations, canned, pre-cooked, and ready to eat. There was enough food to feed 5 men for a year. Ted had opened 36 cans. He'd eaten something, but the vast majority of the rations remained untouched. And in a cabinet in the same shed, there was an even larger supply of dehydrated food. Enough to keep all the men alive for months and months. Ted never opened that cabinet. Why? Ted Weiher had lost between 80 and 100 pounds when he died. He weighed only 120 pounds. He had literally starved to death, surrounded by food. He had died frozen, with heat available just feet away. His feet were severely frostbitten, gangrenous. 3 toes on his right foot and 2 toes on his left foot had fallen off, and his shoes were never found. But in the trailer, investigators found Gary Mathias's sneakers, which suggested Gary had also been in the trailer. That perhaps he'd taken Ted's shoes, which were better for the snow, and left. But where to? The sheets tightly tucked around Ted's body suggested someone else had been there with him when he died. Ted couldn't have wrapped himself like that, not with the gangrenous feet he had. Someone had cared for him. Someone had tucked him in, and then left him. On a table beside the bed was a gold watch. The crystal was missing. Ted's family said it didn't belong to him. Whose watch was it? Investigators processed the scene for days. They took photographs. They documented everything. They searched for answers. But every answer generated more questions. And then, 2 days after discovering Ted's body, they found more bodies. June 6, 1978, 2 days after finding Ted. Search teams were combing the area between the trailer and where the mercury had been found, about 19 miles apart. About 11 miles from the trailer, on opposite sides of the road, they found the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling, best friends, found separated by the road, both dead from hypothermia. Scavenger animals had been at the bodies. Of Bill Sterling, only bones remained. Of Madruga's body, more remained, but it too had been partially devoured by wildlife. Based on the location of the bodies, it seemed they'd never made it to the trailer. They died on the way, walking through deep snow without proper clothing, without appropriate shoes. Why hadn't they stayed with the car? Why had they walked toward the mountains, away from civilization, into a winter wilderness? 2 days later, on June 8th, they found Jackie Hewitt. His father, who had insisted on joining the search despite police telling him not to, was the one who found Jackie's jacket. When he picked it up, Jackie's spine fell out of the jacket. Jackie's remains were found about 2 miles northeast of the trailer, which suggested he may have made it to the trailer with Ted and Gary, but then left. Why? Was he looking for help? Did he get lost? Now they had 4 bodies. Ted, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jackie Hewitt. All dead. All in circumstances that made no sense. But one man was missing. Gary Mathias, 25 years old. Army veteran. Diagnosed with schizophrenia but stable on medication. Gary Mathias was never found. Not his body. Not his bones. Not any sign of what happened to him. Investigators searched for weeks more. They combed the forest. They followed every lead, every theory, but Gary Mathias had completely disappeared. And with his disappearance, any possibility of truly understanding what had happened that night disappeared. Because Gary was the only one in the group who had survival experience. The only one who'd served in the army. The only one who would know how to use a military P-38 can opener to open the ration cans. And investigators believed Gary had been in the trailer with Ted, based on the opened cans and the sneakers he left behind. So what happened to Gary Mathias? In the months and years that followed, countless theories emerged about what happened to the Yuba County Five. Theory 1. They got lost ***. Maybe after the game they took a wrong turn. Maybe they wanted to visit Gary's friends in the small town of Forbestown and got confused near Oroville, which put them on the mountain road. But this theory had problems. Jack Madruga knew the area well. He'd driven to Chico many times, and the route from Chico to Yuba City was incredibly straightforward. There were no confusing turns. Plus, they continued driving up the mountain for miles and miles, going deeper and deeper into the wilderness. At some point, they would have known they were going the wrong way. Theory 2. Gary Mathias had a psychotic episode ***. Gary had schizophrenia. He was on medication, but his medication was at home. If he'd forgotten it after a day without it, he might have started experiencing paranoia or delusions. Maybe he convinced the others they were being followed, that they needed to hide in the mountains, and the others who trusted Gary followed him. But this theory also had problems. Nobody at the basketball game or at the convenience store noticed Gary acting strangely, and his doctors considered him one of their most outstanding success cases. He was highly functional on his medication. Plus, his friends weren't stupid. If Gary had been having an obvious episode, they would have known something was wrong. Theory 3. Someone forced them ***. This was the theory the families believed. That someone, maybe someone they saw at the game or at the store, had forced or scared them into driving to the mountains. Jack Madruga's mother, Mabel, said, "There was some force that made them go up there. They wouldn't have run off into the forest like a flock of quail. We know very well someone made them do it." Ted Weiher's sister-in-law suggested, "They saw something at that game in the parking lot. They could have seen it and not even realized they saw it." There was a report from a woman who owned a store in the small town of Brownsville, 30 miles from where the car had been abandoned. She said 4 of the men had come into her store the day after the disappearance, February 25th, in a red pickup truck. She said 2 of them, whom she identified as Hewitt and Sterling, were in a phone booth outside, while the other 2 came inside. She said she immediately noticed they weren't from the area because of their big eyes and facial expressions. Police considered her a credible witness and took her account seriously. But if it really was the boys, what were they doing in a red pickup truck? Whose vehicle was it? And why didn't they ask for help directly? Theory 4. Fear of authorities. Some investigators speculated the boys might have broken the trailer window to get in. And since they knew it was locked, they might have feared being arrested for burglary or trespassing if they used anything they found there. This would explain why Ted didn't use the propane, the food, the clothing. He was afraid of stealing things that didn't belong to him. But this theory doesn't explain why they didn't make fire with the materials already available, or why they didn't leave the trailer to seek help once they realized they were in trouble. No theory explained all the facts, and with Gary Mathias missing, they could never know the complete truth. Gary Dale Mathias remains the most puzzling piece of this puzzle. He was the only one who'd served in the army, the only one with survival training, the only one who would know how to navigate in the wilderness, how to use military equipment, how to stay alive in extreme conditions. And he was the only one whose body was never found. For decades, people speculated about what happened to Gary. Some believed he'd been responsible for taking the others to the mountains, that during a psychotic episode, he'd convinced them they were in danger and needed to hide. Others believed Gary was as much a victim as the rest, that something or someone had forced them all up that mountain. And some believed Gary might have survived, that somehow he'd managed to get out of the mountains and started a new life elsewhere. His sister, Tammy Phillips, said in the Netflix documentary Files of the Unexplained, "I think he was weeks without his medication, which would have impacted his mental health. I don't think he made it out of there any more than the other boys did." But others weren't so sure. Jack Madruga's niece, Kathy Roberts, claimed the four men were afraid of Gary, that his mental condition made him unpredictable and sometimes frightening. Could Gary have done something that scared them so much they fled into the cold without proper shoes, without proper clothing? In October 2020, the Yuba County Sheriff's Department issued a letter saying, "It is believed Gary Mathias is a victim of a criminal act. This case remains open as a missing person/homicide case." The letter was made public in October 2023 after a records request, which means that, officially, investigators now believe Gary Mathias was murdered, that he didn't survive, that his body is somewhere in Plumas National Forest, waiting to be found. Or maybe it will never be found. The forests are vast. There are millions of acres of mountainous, dense, wild terrain. A body could disappear there and never be discovered, especially if animals got to it first. So what happened to Gary Mathias? Nobody knows for sure, and that makes this case even more chilling. More than 45 years have passed since the Yuba County Five disappeared, and there are still no definitive answers. Ted Weiher's autopsy showed he died from a combination of hypothermia and starvation, but that only explains how he died. It doesn't explain why he stayed in that trailer for weeks, not using the resources that were literally within his reach. Ted wasn't stupid. He had disabilities, yes, but he could function independently. He could dress himself. He could do simple tasks. So why didn't he open the cabinet with food? Why didn't he turn on the propane tank? Some investigators speculate Ted was waiting for someone to return, waiting for instructions, waiting to be told it was okay to use the things in the trailer. Ted was a rule follower, someone who did what he was told. If someone had told him to wait, not to touch anything, he would have obeyed, even if it meant dying. The autopsies of Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jackie Hewitt were less revealing. All had died from exposure. All had been walking through deep snow without proper clothing. Why didn't they go back to the car? From where the Mercury was found to where Madruga and Sterling died was about 11 miles. 11 miles through snowy mountains, in the darkness, without flashlights, without GPS. That suggests they weren't just lost. They were fleeing from something, or being guided by someone. But who and why? Joseph Shans, the man who said he saw them on the mountain that night, died in 1990. He took his secrets to the grave. He could never fully clarify what he saw, what he heard, what really happened. The woman from the store in Brownsville who said she saw four of the men in a red pickup truck could never definitively identify them, and the truck was never found. The families searched for answers for years. Jack Madruga's mother, Mabel, spent the rest of her life investigating, talking to journalists, pressuring police, demanding they not forget about her boys. She died in 2013, never knowing what happened to her son. Ted Weiher's mother, Imogene, also spent decades searching for answers. She died in 2010, equally without resolving the mystery. And for the families that remain, the pain doesn't fade. It only transforms. It becomes a permanent presence, a weight that never disappears. This case is known as America's Dyatlov Pass for good reason. In February 1959, 9 experienced hikers died in mysterious circumstances in Russia's Ural Mountains. It became known as the Dyatlov Pass incident. The hikers had fled their tent in the middle of the night, many in underwear, leaving behind shoes, warm clothing, and supplies. They were found months later, dead from hypothermia, with inexplicable injuries and evidence they'd been terrified of something. The parallel with Yuba County is haunting. In both cases, people who should have known better abandoned safety in deadly conditions. In both cases, they left behind resources that could have saved them. In both cases, some survived for weeks before finally succumbing to the elements. And in both cases, nobody really knows what made them act so irrationally. In the Dyatlov case, theories include avalanches, military testing, encounters with hostile indigenous people, and even paranormal activity. In the Yuba County case, theories are equally varied. An encounter with criminals, a mass psychotic episode, irrational fear, or some traumatic event that made them flee. But no theory explains all the facts. And like Dyatlov Pass, the Yuba County case will probably never be fully solved. There are too many missing pieces, too many dead witnesses, too much time has passed. But that doesn't stop people from trying to solve the mystery. Over the years, darker theories have emerged about what could have happened to the Yuba County Five. The organized crime theory. Some believe the boys might have witnessed something they shouldn't have seen. Maybe they saw a drug deal. Maybe they saw a murder. And someone chased them to make sure they couldn't testify. This theory would explain why they drove toward the mountains. They were being pursued. It would explain why they abandoned the car. They'd been caught up to and were being threatened. But it doesn't explain why there were no signs of violence on most of the bodies. It doesn't explain why Ted survived for weeks in the trailer. The cult theory. In the 70s, California had its fair share of cult activity. Some speculate the boys might have been targeted by a cult that practiced some kind of ritual involving isolation and suffering. This theory has no real evidence to support it, but it persists on the internet. The government experiment theory. The trailer's location was near military installations. Some conspiracy theorists believe the boys might have stumbled upon some kind of classified experiment and were silenced. Again, no evidence, but the theory exists. The theory that Gary did it. This is perhaps the darkest theory of all. That Gary Mathias, during a psychotic episode, somehow convinced or forced the others up the mountain. That he kept them captive in the trailer. That he controlled when they could eat what they could use. And then, when they were all dead or dying, he escaped. Maybe he committed suicide somewhere remote. Maybe he kept walking until he died. Jack Madruga's niece hinted at this theory, saying the other men were afraid of Gary. But this theory has significant problems. How would Gary have controlled for grown men for weeks? Why wouldn't they have left the trailer when he was sleeping or distracted? And if Gary were responsible, why open cans for Ted? Why tuck him in sheets when he was dying? Nothing fits completely. The Yuba County Five case has fascinated generations of true crime investigators, psychologists, amateur detectives, and podcasters. It's appeared in countless TV shows, documentaries, and articles. In 2024, Netflix released Files of the Unexplained, with a full episode dedicated to the case. The case has been discussed on Reddit forums, Facebook groups, YouTube channels. People still debate what could have happened, still propose new theories. And occasionally, someone claims to have new information. In 2017, a man claimed Gary Mathias had been living in a small Montana town for years. Police investigated. It turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. In 2020, a hunter claimed to have found clothing and shoes in the forest that matched descriptions of what the boys were wearing. Investigators checked the area. They found nothing conclusive. Plumas National Forest is enormous. Over 1.2 million acres of mountainous terrain. There are lakes, rivers, canyons, caves. There are thousands of places where a body could be hidden. And Gary Mathias could be in any of them. Or maybe he's not in the forest at all. Maybe he escaped and died somewhere else. We'll never know, but the case remains open. Officially, the Yuba County Sheriff's Department still lists Gary Mathias as a missing person, still accepts tips, If you have information, you can call 530-749-7777. But after 45 years, the chances of it being solved are almost nil. Too much time has passed. Too many witnesses have died. Too much evidence has been lost. And so the Yuba County 5 case remains as one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. A reminder that sometimes questions don't have answers. Sometimes the truth is lost forever. Despite all the theories, there are some facts we know for certain. We know that 5 men went to a basketball game on February 24, 1978. Jack Madruga, 30 years old. Jackie Hewitt, 24 years old. Ted Weiher, 32 years old. Bill Sterling, 29 years old. Gary Mathias, 25 years old. We know they left the game around 10 p.m. and bought snacks at Bears Market. We know they somehow ended up 70 miles east of Chico, on a remote mountain road in Plumas National Forest. We know they abandoned a perfectly functional vehicle and walked toward the snowy mountains. We know Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jackie Hewitt died from exposure and hypothermia on the way to the Forest Service trailer. We know Ted Weiher and probably Gary Mathias made it to the trailer. We know Ted survived there for 8 to 13 weeks before dying of starvation and hypothermia, despite being surrounded by food, heat, and clothing. We know Gary Mathias disappeared and was never found. And we know none of this makes sense. Every fact generates more questions. Why did they go east instead of south? What made them abandon the car? Why didn't they use the resources in the trailer? Where is Gary Mathias? Before we get to the end of the story, I need to know. Are you still here? Where are you listening from? What time is it? Leave it in the comments. And if you've made it this far in the story, you deserve thanks. Subscribe to this channel. Like it. Share this video with someone who loves unsolved mysteries. Turn on notifications. Because stories like this need to be told. They need to be remembered. Now, for the final chapter. The Yuba County 5 should have returned home on February 25, 1978. They should have played their Special Olympics tournament game. They should have won their medals. They should have gone to Los Angeles for their week-long vacation. They should have lived their lives. But something happened on that mountain road. Something we'll never fully understand. And 5 families were left with holes that would never be filled. Mabel Madruga, Jack's mother, spent the last years of her life demanding answers, pressuring detectives, talking to the media, keeping her son's story alive. She died without knowing what happened to Jack. Imogene Weiher, Ted's mother, did the same. She investigated. She pressed. She refused to let people forget. She died without knowing why her son didn't use the food and heat that would have saved him. And Gary Mathias's sisters, who are still alive today, continue searching for answers. We still need to know, one of his sisters said in 2024. We need to know what happened to Gary. We need to close this chapter. But that closure may never come deep down. This case will probably never be solved. There are too many missing pieces. Too much time has passed. Too much evidence was lost or destroyed. And the only person who could tell us what really happened, Gary Mathias, has disappeared. Perhaps forever. So what does this case leave us with? It leaves us with a warning that the world is stranger and more dangerous than we think. That inexplicable things happen. That sometimes people disappear and we never know why. It leaves us with empathy for 5 men who just wanted to watch a basketball game, for their families who never stopped searching, for the investigators who did everything they could. And it leaves us with mystery, with questions that will never be answered, with a puzzle that will never be completed. The Yuba County 5, Jack Madruga, Jackie Hewitt, Ted Weiher, Bill Sterling, and Gary Mathias. Let's remember their names. Let's remember their stories. And let's remember that some mysteries remain unsolved, not because nobody cares, but because the truth sometimes gets lost in the silence of snowy mountains, where secrets remain buried forever. If you made it this far, if you listened to this complete story, thank you. Thank you for keeping the memory of these 5 men alive. Thank you for caring. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. like this video. Share it with someone who appreciates unsolved mysteries and true crime. Turn on notifications for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments. Where did you listen to this story from? What time is it where you are? And what do you think is the most likely explanation for what happened to the Yuba County Five? Thank you for listening. Until the next story.